If you park a Cessna 195 on any ramp in America, you'll have a crowd around it before the prop quits turning. Polished aluminum, a fat round nose, a cabin you climb up into and walk forward through like a little airliner. Most of the folks standing there will tell you it's the prettiest thing Cessna ever built, and they're probably right. Then look at how it's sold. Cessna built the Businessliner family for 7 years, from 1947 to 1954, put just under 1,200 of them on the field, and closed the line for good. That same spring of 1947, a few blocks across Wichita, Beech rolled out an airplane of its own. That one is still coming off the line today in 2026 with more than 17,000 built. The Beechcraft Bonanza. So, why did the prettiest airplane Cessna ever built, the one folks still cross a ramp to stand next to, lose to the Beech sitting right beside it? Before the war, the fast cabin class single was a rich man's airplane, and a short list of machines owned that world. Beech built the most celebrated of them, the Model 17 Stagger Wing, a negative stagger biplane with its lower wing set out ahead of the upper, which first flew in 1932 and turned quick enough to win the 1936 Bendix Trophy outright in the hands of Louise Thaden, beating a field of men to do it. Out of Tulsa came the all-metal Spartan Executive that oil money flew, and out of Wayne, Michigan, the gull-winged Stinson Reliant. And every one of them rode behind a big round radial in real plush comfort, the quickest of them brushing 200 miles an hour. These were the airplanes a doctor or an oil man flew himself, dripping with class, and the Stagger Wing is the one that made Walter and Olive Ann Beech's name. But when the shooting stopped in 1945, both Wichita companies, Beech and Cessna, building airplanes a few miles apart in the same Kansas town, went chasing that same well-heeled customer, the businessman who wanted to fly himself somewhere and step out looking like somebody. Beech walked away from the Stagger Wing it had built its reputation on, shut that old biplane line down at the close of the 40s after better than 700 had been built, and bet its future on a clean sheet of paper. Cessna did the opposite. Cessna looked at the Stagger Wing's empty throne and set out to build its rightful heir, a big radial-engine cabin cruiser cut from the very same cloth, only now done in smooth aluminum instead of the old fabric and welded steel tube. The 195 grew straight out of Cessna's own past. It traced its bloodline back to the 1934 C-34 Airmaster, the slick cantilever wing cabin single that carried Cessna through the Depression, and to the pre-war Cessna 165 that came after it. The 195 kept that same strutless wing and went 2 steps further, becoming the first Cessna built entirely out of metal, and the first production airplane anywhere to ride on spring steel landing gear, the springy legs that air racing legend Steve Whitman had worked out under his own racers and then sold to Cessna. Those legs worked so well they went on to hold up nearly every Cessna single for the next half-century. So even fresh off the line, the 195 carried one real piece of forward-looking DNA inside a design that everywhere else looked firmly backward. That backward-looking part started right up front, with the engine. The 195 carried a Jacobs radial, a 7-cylinder round engine of 755 cubic inches that everybody called the Shaky Jake, putting out anywhere from 245 to 300 horsepower depending on which version a buyer ordered, with the smooth 275 generally reckoned the most reliable of the bunch. Its little brother, the cheaper 190, used a 240-horse Continental W670 instead, an engine said to be the personal favorite of Cessna's own president, Dwayne Wallace, the engineer who had made his name racing that very C-34 Airmaster around the pylons back in the 30s. Only 233 of those Continental-powered 190s ever got built before Cessna dropped the model in 1953, which left the Jacobs-powered 195 as the heart of the line. Either way, the formula came down to a big round engine and a tailwheel, in a post-war moment when the rest of the industry was already drifting towards something lighter, lower, and easier to fly. All that radial muscle and cabin-class metal carried a price to match its presence on the ramp. A 1947 Cessna 190 listed at $12,750, at a time when Cessna would sell you a two-seat 140 for $3,495, so the Businessliner cost the better part of 4 of the company's own trainers. The Jacobs-powered 195 ran higher still, and by the time the line shut down in 1954, the price had climbed past $20,000, all the way to $24,700 for the last 195B. For that kind of money, you got the most beautiful airplane on the field, and you got the past. Walk up to a 195 on the ramp, and the size of it stops you. The wing stretches 36 feet across with no strut anywhere holding it up. The polished fuselage runs 27 feet nose to tail, and the whole airplane stands 7 feet tall on those long spring steel legs, so high that Cessna built a little step into the belly that folds down when you open the cabin door. You climb up that step and walk forward up a center aisle past 2 individual front seats that each slide 15 inches on their rails to what owners only ever call the flight deck. Behind you sit roll-down windows like a car and a Southwind gas heater tucked under the rear bench that throws instant cabin heat the way the twins do. And across that bench, 3 grown adults ride abreast with room to move around. By the time you're strapped in, the thing feels like a small airliner you happen to fly yourself. All of that room came from a problem up front. The Jacobs radial is about 42 inches across, 3.5 feet of round engine, and Cessna had to swell the whole fuselage out wide just to wrap sheet metal around it. That fat nose is the very reason 3 adults fit shoulder to shoulder on the back bench. So the same round engine that blocks your view straight ahead is the one that turns a light airplane into a living room. That's the deal this airplane strikes everywhere you look. You pay for something up front and you get back something you didn't expect. The Jake earns its keep and then some. The 7-cylinder radial gives you torque, a sound nothing else on the field makes, and a stout, simple power plant with the muscle to haul better than half a ton of people and bags to a gross weight of 3,350 pounds. What it charges in return is drag, since a round engine is a barn door in the wind, along with weight up front and a steady thirst for oil. It holds 5 gallons in its tank and burns a quart of that every hour. It wants the prop pulled through by hand before you light it, so a slug of oil settled in a low cylinder can't bend a rod, and it runs only 1,000 to 1,200 hours before it comes off the airplane for a $30,000 overhaul. Cessna at least made the thing easy to wrench on, because the whole Jacobs rides on a mount that unbolts and swings out sideways like a door, canted 15 degrees off center, giving a mechanic clean reach at the magnetos, the starter, and the generator, which is the very sight that gets the 195 jokingly called the airplane with the crosswind engine. The wing strikes a bargain of its own. It's the same kind of clean cantilever Cessna had been drawing since the Airmaster, straight tapered and flat, with none of the dihedral, the slight upward V, that most airplanes carry to settle themselves back to level on their own. Leaving that dihedral out gave the 195 its pure lines, and the same airfoil section Cessna would later bolt onto the 150, the 172, and the 182, and it cost the airplane its roll stability. A 195 will not hold a heading on its own, and instead hunts and wanders through a slow, gentle porpoise in pitch that pilots call a phugoid, so you fly it the whole way with your fingertips, feeding in rudder and retrimming on every power change. What comes back across the deal is a set of controls so beautifully harmonized and an airplane so steady in turbulence that owners forgive the constant tending. Take all of that aloft and the bargain finally pays you back. Climb out at 1,200 feet a minute, level off above 8,000, and the 195 trues out around 135 to 145 knots. The Jake rumbling along at 1,900 RPM on 13.5 to 16 gallons an hour. 75 gallons in the tanks buys roughly 4 hours and 700 to 800 miles, enough to make it a real instrument cross-country machine. The catch rides right along with the speed because the same clean airframe that makes it quick also makes it slippery, so it gathers speed in a hurry the moment the nose drops, and that never-ending hunt in pitch wears you down on a long leg in the clouds. The never exceed redline sits at 170 knots, and the handful of 195s that came apart in the air were diving spirals, pilots who lost the airplane in weather and let it run away from them. Down low, it turns honest and gentlemanly again, stalling power off around 62 miles an hour behind split flaps that throw drag without adding lift, so it works a short field well enough without ever quite matching the 180 and 185 that came after it. Every piece of the Businessliner is a deliberate trade, the comfort and the presence and that big round sound all paid for in drag and weight and oil, which makes it a magnificent airplane wrapped around the technology of the decade behind it. Walter Beech wanted something else entirely. His brief to his engineers was an airplane that would carry 4 people and their bags in car-like comfort at real airplane speed. And to draw it, Ted Wells handed the job to a 5-man team under Ralph Harmon, most of them just off Beech's wartime XA-38 Grizzly attack plane program. When their airplane first flew on the 22nd of December, 1945, with test pilot Vern Karstens at the controls, it looked nothing like the fabric biplane that had carried the Beech name through the 30s. Everything about it was aimed at going fast on little power. The Bonanza was a low-wing, all-metal airplane crowned with that famous V-tail, 2 angled surfaces that Harmon's team set up to do the work of 3, splitting yaw and pitch between them and shedding the drag and the weight of a separate fin. Up front, in place of a heavy radial, sat a Continental E185, a horizontally opposed flat 6 of just 471 cubic inches that made 165 horsepower all day and 185 for takeoff. And underneath rode the piece that would change the whole industry: retractable tricycle gear, a nose wheel out front that wanted to roll straight, and main legs that folded up clean into the wings in flight. Add it all up, and the little Beech did far more with far less. That clean airframe and that small flat engine pulled it along at about 150 knots, 165 to 175 miles an hour, right there with the 195 or a touch quicker, and it did it sipping well under 12 gallons an hour where the Jacobs drank 16. On just 40 gallons of fuel, it would still cover close to 750 miles, the same reach the Cessna needed 75 gallons to manage. It weighed 2,550 pounds at gross against the 195's 3,350 and came in empty at just 1,458, yet it still carried close to 1,000 pounds of people and bags. And a brand new one in 1947 sold for $7,975, climbing to $8,945 partway through the run, which set a Bonanza at roughly 2/3 the price of the big Cessna. So here sat the 2 airplanes side by side, aimed at the same buyer and the same mission. Cessna matched the Beech's speed by hanging a round engine out front with 2/3 again the displacement, 100-odd more horsepower, and 3 to 6 extra gallons an hour pouring through it. Beech got the very same job done with half the engine, less fuel, less weight, and a few $1,000s still in the buyer's pocket. The whole difference started with what was bolted to the front of each airplane. That Continental Flat 6 was the shape of everything coming, and not by accident. Where the Jacobs hung its wall of cylinders out in the slipstream, a horizontally opposed engine lies down low and narrow, so a designer can wrap a slim, fast airframe around it, cool it without a fight, and keep the oil where it belongs. That is why the same 2 names, Continental and Lycoming, would soon sit under the cowl of nearly every light airplane built after the war. The Jacobs Radial was a marvel of its era, and a high-maintenance roommate the rest of the week. Air cooling meant all 7 jugs rode out in the breeze, each one a fresh place to weep oil, and with an old wet vacuum pump on top of it, the thing leaked so steadily that owners still joke about wiping the belly down after every flight while their buddies are tied down and halfway home. Its oil temperature climbs if it sits too long on a hot taxiway. So 195 drivers learn to steer clear of big, busy airports with long waits for the active runway. Set all of that against a flat engine that just runs and goes home, and the whole general aviation industry came down on the side of the flat engine. The Radial held on where its brawn still earned its keep, out on the warbirds and the big bush planes and the crop dusters. But in the personal airplane, the machine a man bought to fly his family somewhere on a Saturday, the round engine was finished by the time the 195 died, and it never came back. The Bonanza's nose wheel turned out to be every bit as decisive as its engine because of where it sits. A nose wheel rides out ahead of the center of gravity, so the moment the airplane starts to drift, it pulls itself back straight. The 195's tail wheel rides behind the center of gravity instead, and a heavy 195 carries that weight well aft of the main wheels. So the tail is forever trying, just a little, to swing around and trade places with the nose. Cessna gave the airplane a long wheelbase to fight that tendency, a good 20 feet from the mains back to the tail wheel, and even that isn't enough. Let the swing build past 10 or 15 degrees, and there isn't brake enough on the airplane to catch it. That swap has a name, the ground loop, and in a 195 it usually means bent metal in the gearbox, the fuselage, and the wings, with the worst of them written off right where they stop. The accident record bears the physics out, and it is brutal. When Aviation Consumer combed through the 100 most recent 195 wrecks, 70 of them came during landing or takeoff, the highest share of any airplane the magazine had ever reviewed. 54 of those 70 were plain loss of control on the runway, and 12 ended with the airplane on its back, most of them pilots who stood on the brakes to stop a swing and pitch that tail-heavy nose right over. The handful of takeoff accidents were nearly all crosswind or downwind departures, the exact conditions a 195 will not forgive. It is a heavy taildragger that demands real footwork and a careful hand, and it punishes the pilot who gets lazy on the rollout. The men who fly them love them anyway, and they are honest about the bargain. They will tell you a 195 flies like a single-engine DC-3 and parks like a celebrity, and in the next breath, they will warn you about the nose. That same big round engine that gave the cabin its width blocks the whole world straight ahead and off to the right. So on the ground, anything sitting between 12 and 2 o'clock is invisible unless you swing the airplane to look. And the old hands swear that if you assume nothing is there, something will be. Pilots have taxied 195s into runway lights, fuel trucks, and fence posts they never saw coming. The airplane asks more of you on the ground than almost anything built since, while the Bonanza, with its nose wheel keeping it straight and its low cowl leaving the view wide open, asked almost nothing. Lay the two scoreboards side by side, and the gap is almost hard to believe. Cessna built just under 1,200 airplanes in the whole 190 and 195 family, the military LC-126s included, across 7 model years before it shut the line down in 1954, and nearly 80% of that run were 195s. Beech built 1,500 of the very first straight 35 Bonanzas by themselves in 1947 and 1948, more airplanes in 2 years than Cessna managed in 7. Then, where the 195 had nowhere left to grow, the Bonanza grew into whatever the market asked for next. The flat 6 up front nearly doubled in power over the years, climbing from 165 horsepower through the E225 and the fuel-injected IO470 and IO520. The cabin stretched to 6 seats in the Model 36, and turbocharging arrived to carry it up high, so one basic design rolled on through the A35, the V35, and the Model 36 to become the longest continuously produced airplane in history, more than 17,000 built, with Textron turning out the G36 to this day. The 195 reached a commercial dead end because its formula had finished saying what it had to say. A radial bolted to a taildragger could be made beautiful, but it could not be made modern, and Beech had read the post-war buyer exactly right. That buyer wanted the very things the Bonanza was built around, an airplane that was efficient on half the fuel, a few $1,000s cheaper, and easy enough that the nose wheel kept it pointed straight all by itself. Cessna knew which way the wind was blowing, even while it was still hand-building radials, because the proof was sitting on its own factory floor. During the very same years the 195 was coming together, Cessna was also turning out the Cessna 170, a 4-seat taildragger that had already traded the round engine for a flat Continental 6 and was selling like hotcakes. The company had even kept the one forward-looking piece of the 195, Steve Whitman's spring steel gear, and bolted it under the 170 and everything else it built. So Cessna had already dropped the radial, and all that was left to drop was the tail wheel. In 1956, 2 years after the 195 died, it did exactly that, hanging a nose wheel on the 170's successor and badging it the 172 Skyhawk. That airplane went on to become the most produced aircraft in the history of the world, better than 44,000 built, riding on a flat engine and tricycle gear, the very recipe Beech had written down back in 1945. So, Cessna arrived at the future too. It just took one more airplane to get there, and that airplane was the 195. The 195 sits right on the seam between two aviation eras, the first all-metal Cessna and the last Cessna ever built with a radial engine, an airframe that handed its landing gear forward to the Skyhawk while keeping its big round heart planted firmly in the past. So that's it for today's video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. It goes a long way for us.